NextGen Q&A Series. I am joined today by none other than Michael Cruz, CEO of North Texas Wealth Management. Today's topic is baby boomers, millennials, and wealth. So, Mike, I invited you on to see how much trouble we could get into talking about this topic. And so maybe to kick us off, something I hadn't told you, and I intentionally didn't tell you, that because, we had this talks kind of scheduled, and I studied up on it and everything. Over the weekend, in one of my MBA classes, this spontaneous, we weren't even talking about this spontaneous, very spirited discussion broke out among classmates and professors along the lines of, are millennials really lazy? Did boomers really have it much better off, and that's how they were successful? And so I figured maybe I could just kick that right over to you, and we'll just solve this right here and now.
Just big
we'll
question,
just take care
right?
of it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
All right, I appreciate you starting off with just the biggest question, Seth. But I think when we talk about millennials and baby boomers, I think it's just probably the first step is not to just generalize everybody and realize that there's exceptions to the rule. But it does bring up a great question, and I think maybe start with baby boomers. Have they had it easy, or has it been kind of the right place at the right time? And really, if you think about baby boomers, I think they've actually had it really difficult in that all the times they were saving, we went through the savings and loans, and interest rates were really high. So many baby boomers remember interest rates for housing being up at 16-17% for mortgages. And then in that, the real estate market was volatile. And so many times they bought a home, they went to go sell that home for less than they bought it for years later while paying all of that interest. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty difficult start. And then, also, the dot-coms, and if they didn't invest right, many times they lost way too much in the technology firms being overexposed. And, but there are some positives for baby boomers. They had pension plans that millennials don't have today. So, better benefits. And they stayed on their jobs for a long period of time. So 30, 40 years was pretty normal. They didn't, move around as much. And so they had a little bit more stability in the workforce. But then when they did go to retire, we've spent the last, decade or so with interest rates near zero. So if you think about that, while they were saving early on, there weren't really the 401k plans and savings vehicles that there are today. And then once those became available and baby boomers saved up until retirement, then they go to invest it, and interest rates are at rock bottom zero for a decade. That made it pretty difficult. And so I wouldn't say that baby boomers have had it handed to them by any stretch. And there was a lot of learning to go on during that time period as well, because nobody was really talking about retirement planning when the baby boomers began. And so that's pretty different when you think about the millennials. The baby boomer generation did talk about their finances to their kids. Whereas the baby boomer generation, when they go back to look at, that greatest generation before World War II, it was pretty typical you didn't talk to your kids about finances.
I love it. I love the perspective. And so that's why I wanted to bring you in and talk about that, because we have, and you have, a really unique perspective on this. Because, if you're not in this line of work, you have sat down and looked into the finances of hundreds of clients. Thousands,
yeah.
right, over the years.
Yeah.
And many of which are in that baby boomer category.
Right.
And I think there is that tendency to kind of focus on the more near or more recent past in terms of different crises and things. But you're exactly right. The baby boomer generation was not without crises of their own.
Sure.
So true.
Yep.
So true. And I know we kind of started off making light of this. So I think that's the only way we can get through this topic with all the different opinions out there. But this is something that, especially our baby boomer clients, this is a big issue, right? Because they're looking at their kids and grandkids, and maybe they're kind of struggling to get off, out on their own, and they're looking at their own portfolio and going, should I be helping, or well, I had to learn hard work, and so these topics it's not just some economic report. This has real implications for individuals and families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key is there's a conflicting value. I want them to learn some lessons the hard way like I did.
Right.
And then at the same time, you're like, well, I don't want my kids to have to do the hard things that I went through, I can make it easier on them. And at the end of the day, sometimes it's just difficult to find that balance.
Yeah. So how do you walk that line of, because that's why we do what we do, is we want the next generation to be in a better position. But what does that mean?
Yeah.
Does that mean I'm going to give them money? Does that mean I'm going to give them values? And so that's a tough.
Right. And I think I've even experienced it with my kids. And I think it's the balance of making sure that, you're teaching them and not overprotecting them from the world. So you give them some hard challenges, but you're there to coach them and teach them and encourage them through it, rather than prevent the trial altogether. Right.
Tough. Okay.
Tough love. Yes.
So I want to put a little data into the conversation here, right? So what in the reality is if you're an individual or you're a family, let's say you're a baby boomer and you are contemplating maybe financially assisting your kids, you do kind of want to look at some data to go, am I seeing this right?
Yeah.
Do they have it worse off or not, right? So here's one data point, not the be all end all, but certainly interesting. This is from the Federal Reserve. This is from right out of the St. Louis Fed. So this is kind of a dense stat here. So I'll kind of just talk through it here. It says at age 30, 38% of college educated millennials own homes. That is less than the 54% of boomer college educated workers and 49% of boomer non-college educated workers who own homes at the same age. So kind of restate that. Millennials at age 30, if you're college educated, 38% of them own homes. Versus rewind back to when the boomers were 30, 54% of college educated boomers own homes at 30, 49%. So even the non-college educated boomers owned homes at a higher rate than millennials.
Yeah.
Does that make or break the case one way or the other? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. And if we look back, interest rates were really high for the baby boomers, during that time. However, today prices are so high. So even though interest rates aren't as high, prices are. So it's really difficult right now to jump into the workforce where labor rates haven't increased as rapidly as we would expect them to.
Yeah.
And those are some of the challenges that the millennials have faced going into, COVID years, needing to maybe live at home during that time period, not be able to finish college as fast as they had hoped. It was a pretty big setback. Jobs weren't quite as available, or they were remote, maybe not paying as much. And so it's all challenges that have prevented them from home ownership as quickly. But just the shortage of homes and the population growth make those prices, elevated, and probably will continue to stay elevated.
And for better or for worse, we do tend to use home ownership as one of those metrics of American wealth.
Yes,
like, do you
absolutely.
own your home? Do you not? How well are you doing? That's kind of an interesting barometer there. Now, you mentioned another piece I kind of want to touch on. You said the C word. You said college.
Mm-hmm.
So college education, that's another kind of a metric we use about, how you doing, again, for better or for worse. And college is expensive anymore.
It's really expensive. Yeah.
Preaching to the choir.
More, yeah. And I think when previously many people went into the military to help pay for college, or, they saved for it, they worked during college, they paid for it, and it was much more affordable. And, there was a lot of effort to support more folks going to college. So they created more student loans, more availability, grants, scholarships, all of those things. But in essence, by providing more financial aid, they created the problem of the universities being able to raise prices and people still be able to make it work. I wouldn't call it affordable, I'll just say make it work. And not really understanding the ramifications of having so much debt as they step out into the workforce, and then maybe salaries not being what they think they're going to be, and then realizing it might take decades to actually recover from that student loan debt.
Right. It just delays everything, right?
Delays.
Yep.
So
I graduate school, I got this debt, right? And then home prices are high and now rates are high. And so you kind of just push off everything, right? And it's interesting because, when we think about college, and actually in that same Federal Reserve piece, they actually defend the ROI of a college education.
Sure.
It's just the return is shifted farther out on the timeline.
Yeah.
So it's still worthwhile from the perspective
Yeah.
of these folks, but it certainly does kind of push everything back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you said, is it too expensive to go to college? I'd absolutely say no, it's worth it. But be a little bit more careful maybe of what you borrow. And there are the mistakes to avoid. Some college attendees actually borrow and pay for other things besides just college during that time period. So they might walk out with $200,000 of debt where it should be maybe half of that because they weren't, vigilant during that time period. But the other part of it is you don't have to go to college to be successful. In fact, there are so many trade jobs today, plumbers, electricians,
Yep.
welders, that are in short supply, and they actually can many times make as much or more than a college graduate if you're willing to go that route. So I don't think somebody not wanting to go to college is shortchanging their trajectory in life, but I would say going to college is not a bad avenue.
Yeah.
It's just you got to be careful about how much you finance. Yeah.
So it sounds like so far we've got, hey, this is probably a more nuanced picture than what
Sure.
people on either side want to make it out to be. We can't generalize. Boomers were not without their own crises. Hey, it is kind of hard out there for the millennials. What are maybe some other angles on this topic that people aren't talking about as much as they should be?
Yeah. I think if we kind of focus on a couple of other stats, 70% of Americans have, more than $10,000 in credit card debt. And that's just kind of across all generations. And I think what I see consistently is even the baby boomers, you kind of fall into two broad categories. Those that have saved, been very frugal, they spent less than they made, are very well off and have done things a certain way that's really benefited them.
Worked.
And then you have the baby boomers that they come into our office and they go, I don't ever plan to retire. I don't think I'll ever be able to retire. And of course we try to help them, but if you're, 60 and you don't have anything saved for retirement and you have a pretty good job with high pay, that makes the hurdle rate even higher. If you have to, want to retire with $120,000 a year and you haven't saved anything, you're in trouble. Right. And so we kind of see those two camps of the people that have sacrificed and prioritized their savings and people that haven't. And I think it's this notion that I'm going to save later when it gets easier, when I have more income or the kids are out of the house or whatever it may be. You delayed that savings, and the ones that are successful prioritized it. And they said, you know what, I'm just going to save 10% of my salary today, always. And then when they get to age 60, they're like, man, I'm glad I did that. It was
Doing okay.
pretty great.
Yeah.
And I kind of saw the same thing when my kids were born. I started saving the month for college. I started saving the month that they were born, right?
Nice.
And it was just a little bit, but it really added up to a lot. When we fast forward 18 years later, I'm like really impressed, and I understand compound interest and investing and everything, and I still was pretty impressed with the account value.
Yeah.
It was surprising. It was just the consistency of doing that monthly for 18 years. And so, the earlier you save, the more consistent you save. It's not rocket science. It's really what helps you be successful. But I would also say millennials fall into those two categories as well, because there's the ones that we meet with that are way ahead. I mean, they got the right education. The parents advised them correctly. They started early. They were disciplined. And by the age of 30, they not only own their own home, they have $500,000 in savings. I mean, it's impressive.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, they are so far ahead of most people we meet with. And then there's the other group of the millennials that we worry about, right? It's almost 40%, especially after COVID, are still living with parents, even around age 30 or after college. And so, you start looking at that trajectory. I'm still living at home. I still want to move out. And they have a lot more expense. They still have student loan expense, starting a family, all these other expenses, and they haven't saved anything yet. You're behind the curve. You gotta get going.
So let's imagine someone who's in that camp,
Mm-hmm.
struggling, debt, student loan debt, credit card debt, having a hard time, don't own their own home, trying to start a family. Now they hear you saying you got to save 10% for time. What would you say to that person to just get some momentum going? I mean, what's the what's that kind of spark that maybe could help them get going?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a couple things, and it's probably somebody enabling them not to make that move. So kind of having that mindset of almost like the immigrant that comes to America and wants to work. A lot of them have 2 to 3 jobs, right? They go to one job, and then in the evening they go to another job. So it's that hustle that they need to really just work really hard to get ahead. Whatever it kind of takes attitude, I think, is really key. And obviously you got to save. So even if save any percentage as an emergency fund, just a cash to fall back on is kind of the starting point, and start making sure that they're spending less than they make. That discipline will carry them on. But I think it's that grind, that hustle. And so if the parents are maybe trying to help, but maybe enabling that, that job from like kind of really getting that hustle in. I like the analogy of like how an eagle does its nest. They raise, this new baby eagle, and then eventually they start adding into the nest some thorns, and they make that nest really uncomfortable.
Okay.
And all of a sudden they want to leave the nest, right?
Wow.
And I think sometimes the nest is too comfortable at home. And so if you start giving them chores, more responsibility and accountability, and maybe encouraging that second job, or maybe they have to pay some of the bills, and they go, this isn't as helpful or, as comfortable as I was hoping. I think I'm going to go out on my own. It has to be a little uncomfortable to move from kind of pain to comfort.
And that might be something that some of the boomer viewers might need to hear too, because it's hard. You hit the nail on the head. Conflicting values, right? Yeah. Conflicting values. I want them to be better off, but I don't want to enable them. And so for those boomer parents, maybe who are kind of cut somewhere in the middle, they're trying to kind of help a little bit with the hopes that will kind of get things going. They don't want to go full on, just kick them out. I mean, maybe that's something that you just spoke to that'd be helpful for them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think you have to kind of draw your boundaries and what you can do. And so one of those boundaries that I want to talk about is don't spend your retirement savings to help your kids, right? And many people will dip into their retirement savings and maybe pay for college or do those things. And it's not a good idea. I like to say you can borrow for college, but you can't borrow for retirement. So you must prioritize retirement over college, helping kids, grandkids, any of that.
Wow. And so some people might hear that and go, but Mike, you don't know how much I love my kids. Right? There's that impulse, right? But to stop and take a step back and go, well, like what really will be best for them in the end?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, do you want to be a burden to your kids? If you spend your retirement down, you're not successful. Do you want to depend on your kids for those later years or for the rest of your life? And most people don't want to do that.
Put your own oxygen mask on first.
That's right. That's it. That's exactly right.
Another data point coming at you. So there is a consulting firm in our industry, Cerulli Associates, and they put out a study in 2022, and they projected that through 2045, greater than $53 trillion will be transferred from baby boomers to their heirs, right? And they're not the only outfit that's saying this. Everyone's saying this, the largest wealth transfer in history. And so I hear that, and I kind of, on the tail end of our prior conversation, and go, boomers apparently have accumulated a lot of wealth. Millennials apparently are kind of struggling. What's to be done with both of those data points in conjunction if you're a family out there kind of wrestle with this?
I think it comes back to one piece or one value, which is education. Financial literacy is low. They don't teach it in school. You don't really have a method to really learn finances and investing and all the things you need to know unless you kind of go into the industry like we did. There's really no mechanism where people just learn how to manage assets and finances, and education's low. And so that's the gap we need to bridge. I would even say for baby boomers, sometimes the education's even low. So they're trying to help their kids, but maybe they're giving the wrong advice. That's just the way they've always done it.
Right.
Yeah. And so we need to increase the education across the board. I think your podcast is a great example of that. The fundamentals to investing. So encouraging kind of that next generation to pay attention and start learning early is really a goal. And then also for baby boomers, they can start kind of roping in their kids and their grandkids, bringing them into the conversation, and ultimately planning like, hey, here's where my assets are. Here's my estate plan. Here's what it looks like. Here's what my wishes are. And, and I think Warren Buffett said it best. He's like, how do you leave? I want to leave enough to my kids that they can do anything, but not so much they can do nothing, right? So it's how do you balance that estate plan where you're really helping and not just enabling? And so thinking through that, but communicating and talking about it early, I think is key.
Education, communication. Now, I'll tell you what, the communication piece, it's tricky, right? So if I'm a baby boomer, I've done all right, got a good retirement. My parents never talked to me about money. Now, all of a sudden, I'm hearing from Mike Cruz, maybe I should start talking with my kids and grandkids about my money, our money. I mean, are you suggesting maybe to start disclosing, or I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Some families are willing to share, some are not. But I think regardless, the best scenario, and I kind of see North Texas Wealth Management playing this critical role, which is come into a room, maybe talk to the estate planning attorney or use your financial planner to guide the conversation. So even if you don't talk about values of your accounts, you start talking about like maybe the structure of accounts. Like there's an IRA here, and this is how it will be taxed. These are tax strategies you could consider implementing if you inherited this asset. And then on the other side, looking at maybe some trust and how to trust work. And that way they're really prepared and kind of know what to expect, maybe what needs to be done, or there's a family farm, or there's, a family limited partnership. And so, how do you get that conversation started, even if you don't even talk about what it's worth, right? It's probably not as important as just understanding the goals, the objectives, the structure of the assets, and then maybe really talking to them more about like, what's your retirement plan look like?
Right.
In the checklist, do you have an emergency fund? Do you have more money coming in than going out? And one thing that became really relevant in our family, my sister unfortunately lost her husband to cancer. And the lesson learned was I helped them get life insurance in place. And that was because of the industry I'm in. I kind of checked on my family, made sure everybody was covered. But many parents aren't having that conversation with their kids. Yeah. And it's kind of the value of, well, they're independent. They should be in charge of their own finances. But what I learned from that was that if my sister would not have had, insurance on her husband, my dad would have never retired. Yeah. Right. He would have been taking care of my sister. Right. And so it impacts multi-generational.
Right. Both ways.
Both ways. Absolutely. And so I think that's the reason the conversation needs to be there. And we need, as financial planners, to be sitting in the room, guiding that conversation and making sure the next generation is doing what they need to do to be successful to relieve the retirees. And the retirees need to have that conversation so they can enjoy their retirement and not worry so much about the next generation.
Yeah. It's okay to talk about money. That's okay to talk about money. And obviously that's, kind of become a growing role of ours, right? Is facilitating those conversations. Because really, you have this awesome financial plan for the retiree, really stick the landing. And then, if they pass all that on, it's just squandered or it's not properly, stewarded, then it's kind of all for naught. So we're really kind of being more proactive on that front.
And we've seen how hard, the baby boomers have worked for their wealth. And it's just a really sad sight when you see that go to the next generation and maybe disappear quickly. Yeah. It's a sad thing where it could have really enabled a great retirement for them as well.
Yeah. So I'm encouraged by this trend of more of those intergenerational conversations being had. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, North Texas Wealth Management started way back in 1968 by a CPA, and we were doing retirement planning really before most firms. We were early into that. And because we were working with baby boomers, near retirees, retirement planning and income planning, it really positions us to be qualified to really help multi-generational. We have a young firm. We're not looking for, we're not retiring with our clients. And that's one of the challenges we see. A third of all advisors are going to retire in the next few years. Right. And so who's there to really educate the next generation? So our advisors have 10 plus years in the industry. They're not new, but they're not retiring with their with, the baby boomer generation. And so that's kind of our mission, is to really be there and be a resource to our clients to have these conversations and help transition, $53 trillion. That's you can't even get your mind around that number. Right. But it's so much wealth transfer. The education necessity is just key.
Yep. I love it. So Mike, what is it about that money conversation? Why do you think that people wouldn't have that money conversation with their kid, or even bring them in and invite them to sit down with their financial planner? What's stopping them from doing that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's fear of, maybe they don't want to share their finances with their kids, or their kids don't want to work with the same financial planner as the parent because they're afraid of, maybe them saying, hey, you haven't saved, you're spending too much, you spent too much on vacation, and then I'm going to tell your parents on you.
Right.
Right. And so they don't really understand that financial planners have a strict confidentiality agreement that we don't share any account information. If it ever comes up, we just don't tell anything, strict walls, and we protect that information very, very tightly. A lot of times I work with, a client, and their boss is a client, and they never know it. I mean, we don't tell them anything. You don't say, oh, so-and-so was in the office today, because, you never know if they skipped work that day to come meet with us, right?
Even the fact that they are or are not a client.
Yeah.
That's something we don't even disclose.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So we're really good about, if someone asks a question like, well, or do they have insurance? Or they say like, well, I'm not able to tell you anything, and I won't tell them anything about you. And we just kind of make light of it, because it's really important. If you don't have that confidentiality, you can't really be successful.
And that's not necessarily to say that they shouldn't share information. That may be a healthy thing. It's just, it's not going to happen from us.
That's right.
If we all get in a room and you want to do that, and that's great.
Yeah. You can share as much as you want to share. We just don't share anything by the principle of our confidentiality.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I'm sitting here thinking, I think that there's a lot of millennials out there who hear a statistic like that, $53 trillion being transferred, and they go, who are all these boomers that have all this money? My parents don't have money.
Yeah.
And I don't think they know. I don't think they know how much money their parents have.
Yeah, it adds up. I mean, if we face it, it's $1 million today. We think of $1 million as like, oh, if I get to $1 million, I can retire. Many baby boomers have $1 million and they can't retire. Yeah. So there are more dollars out there. And then if you add up insurance and real estate and assets, it adds up pretty quickly.
Yep. Mike Cruz, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Appreciate the conversation. Great. Yeah. And we'll see you next time on the NextGen Q&A Series.